Mectaophilo, Morocco, Atarian, all over Atarian, all over North Africa, Sahel, like Nigeria. I'll show you their range in a minute. Cheddarman, England. Nazet Qatar with the airy K. This is a Brazilian version. I like the Brazilian version because they seem to get its age right compared to this version. And compared to this version. And this is the Atarian's range. See the one on the left? In one of my previous videos entitled Pan-Afro-Cooning, I discussed Kamji verse and how this dude is the clown prince of bad faith arguments. His bad faith arguments recently spread to Asar Imhotep, who in a recent video grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and slapped him around, even as a bitch. Kamji verse often works with this website called Y-Fool that has phylogenetic trees for Y chromosome haplogroups. I'm familiar with Y-Fool, but it didn't really have what I coveted. I wanted the African version of Y chromosome K and P, and like I was going to find that, and the F, which I thought I might find, but they get their information from the type of studies that didn't have them, so nobody has them, and I sort of curved it for a moment. Until Kamjiverse made a video arguing that a lot of Y chromosome E that's in Africa comes out of the Nile Valley, specifically from Egypt. And since I don't really trust the clown prince of bad faith arguments, I fact-checked them. And I found that there are some lineages that move like that. But I also saw something that was very interesting, that West Asia had a lot of old E. I knew West Africa also had old E. It reminded me of the many linguists, and I thought there were many, but I soon learned there are more than many. I knew of at least 3, and they had their teachers or whatever, their leads. One was G.K. Campbell Dunn, who did it at a Etymological Dictionary. He compared the Sumerian language in the dictionary to his approximates for a older Proto-Niger-Congo, and similarly with a approximate for Bantu. And I'm saying approximate, and we'll go into why I'm saying this. But the important thing is, and this is something because I read this, he said that it was particularly close to Mende. I also knew about Willibald Wanger, who back in the 30s, he said that Sumerian was the Sanskrit of the Intu, an abbreviation for the Bantu languages. Is it an abbreviation? And I also knew about Hermel Hermstein, who wrote 2 books about this, one dealing with the physical evidence and the other linguistic. African language groups and also Semitic groups were created with the mass comparison method. This is the mass comparison method. You've probably heard of it. It was created with Greenberg. Indo-European language families were created with the comparative method. You can see Indo-European families right there. In his book, The Origin of African Languages, John Claude Mboli used the comparative method on about 8 African languages, and Sumerian, and voila, Sumerian is no longer a language isolate. It's in a language family with Middle Egyptian, Hausa, Zande, and Mende. I know when the layman sees this, they're thinking ancient Egypt had 2 different languages, which shouldn't be that controversial. It was 2 different nations. But for the layman, yeah, because Coptic sort of thought as the extension of Middle Egyptian instead of a separate line, different language, even in the early days. I'm familiar with this. Asar Imhotep has written about it. He's shown sources about it in videos and books. And even in the video where he smited around Kamjiverse, he covered it too. So I'm not going to talk about the 2 different languages of ancient Egypt. I'm going to talk about Sumerian. But at first, I do have to stick with the Saramotep for a moment because there's a reason why this isn't used. People are wedded to the mass comparison method in Greenberg. Now, this is kind of ironic. I was on the Saramotep's channel with a person named Abasi who criticized Mboli's method. And Asar defended Mboli by showing, hey, Greenberg isn't really accepted like that. And I want to memetize the sources from his book, so stick with me. Let's meme it. And I'll show some stills from the video and I'll highlight the book through the stills that he presented, but let's just get to the memification. Hein and Kateva, Greenberg's genetic classifications of African languages by now widely accepted, but being widely accepted does not equate with has been scientifically proven. Next. Robert M.W. Dixon. For many linguists, such views pertaining to Greenberg's method and his Euroasiatic superphylum fall more into the category of religious beliefs than scientifically testable hypotheses. Next. Garrett Demendahl. Niger-Congo is not a proven genetic unity. Next. Roger Blench. Typological criteria, no matter how persuasive the similarities, are not relevant to the genetic classification. Hein and Nurse, Derek Nurse, who I don't have a picture of, it is quite crude for it incorporates no filter for rejecting unrelated lookalikes, nor any means of recognizing highly dissimilar, albeit cognate, items. Next. Roger Blench. Bantu. Definitely not a group. Next. Antonio Lupriano. Thus, Afroasiatic will never be a reconstructible language. And Afroasiatic can only be considered an abstract construct of linguistic features and not a unified system of linguistic realities. G. Tucker Childs. The classification problems with Atlantic have hardly been resolved, but rather have been abandoned for a non-genetic classification. The most recent commentary on the group as a whole admits that the classification is not genetic. This is from the American Journal of Human Genetics, and it is scathing. I'm going to show two quotes. Whereas Greenberg's classification has been widely and uncritically used by human geneticists, it has been rejected by virtually all historical linguists who study Native American languages. His method of multilateral comparisons assembled only superficial similarities between languages, and Greenberg did not distinguish similarities from those due to other factors. Eichenwald, Dixon. We quoted Dinch's methodological principle that only after all possible explanation for the shared features have been exhausted should they be taken to be a genetic inheritance. The opposite procedure appears to have been followed by Africanus. By Africanus, he's talking about the Greenberg languages, the Greenberg method. Anywho, philosophically, I was already building from Mboli's model, but this takedown of the mass comparison method and Greenberg therewith just reinforced where I was already headed. But then I went on Asar Imhotep's channel again, and he also quoted his book again, and I'm just going to let him tell it. But I will fast forward it to a point because the source he brings up starts bringing up other sources, and I had never heard of these other sources.
Right. And so, but what I wanted to show here was that, I stated the affinities between Sumerian and Bantu have been known, or at least hypothesized, since the early 20th century, as the following excerpt confirms. So this is Harry Johnson, or Johnston, in his A Comparative Study of Bantu and Semi-Bantu Languages, Volume 2. So this was in 1922, so essentially 100 years ago that he's making this statement. So, of course, he's a white person of his day, so, he thinks that it was some benevolent whites who came into Africa and black people started speaking their languages. But he makes this important statement here. He says, but the main principles of Bantu syntax, but the main principles of the Bantu syntax and the instinct for dividing nouns into classes based on a quite different distinction from that of sex, may have originated in the mind of some white or quasi-white people of the Mediterranean basin, whose speech and cultus preceded in North Africa, and that of the Libyan, Berber, Egyptian, uh, Hamite, Ethiopian. So all these are white folks to him, right? So such a race of Neolithic, pre-Libyan colonialists or colonists of North Africa may have been akin to the Pelasgian Aegeans of Crete and of prehistoric Greece and Sicily, or it may have come from prehistoric Egypt or from Spain, though Basque has not the slightest affinity with the class language or with the other speech forms of Africa. The only language families outside of Africa which offer the slightest affinity in any way with Bantu tongues are the Sumerian and Dravidian groups, right? So now he's going to go into some people who before him have even noticed the affinities between Sumerian and Bantu. So he says the late Sir Richard Burton had a theory that the Sumerian speech of Mesopotamia exhibited an affinity with Bantu. The Reverend W.A. Crabtree has been writing on this subject in the 1919 volume of the African Society's Journal. All we have right now, all we have any right to surmise is that Bantu and semi-Bantu languages were created by the impact on the Negroes of the Central Sudan of a Mediterranean race speaking a language which preceded the advance of the Aryan, Hamitic, or Semitic tongues. Such early invaders of tropical Africa from the direction of the north may have been the ancestors of the Ful or the Fulani people of Senegambia and northern Nigeria. So, of course, this is, he's a racist of his time. I ain't gonna say he's necessarily a racist, but I'll say he's a racist because their only explanation of the relationship between Sumerian is that it was some white folks who came out of the Middle East and the North Africa and then landed in tropical Africa. And essentially these unknown Negroes in Central Africa adopted the language of the more superior, whites or Hamites. But, that's neither here nor there. The point is that as early as 100+ years ago, and so Wagner's text isn't on here either that you can include, right? They're already showing, and I show some, I cite some other ones in some other contexts in terms of the relationship between Sumerian and Bantu.
Well, well, well. Old 42 wasn't whistling Dixie, was he? It wasn't just a few linguists here and there. This is something that people have talked about for 100 years. Even back then, you had the same type of racists with dynastic race delusions, with the same shell game and moving goalposts of Zoid science, going into the forest of Africa to teach people some language. It's not totally crack-minded. There is some odd phenotypical overlap, so I can understand the layman and the educated, because there are people who have reactions to this. And one common one I see from someone like Ngozi is he starts talking about how Iraq has these marsh Arabs. But to me, this is sort of hypocritical because he's also wedded to Greenberg. And even with Greenberg, you have the Syrians and the Hausa, who ironically are also in Mboli's language family with Sumerian. But even then, you have people who are far away genetically. But let's remember one thing. The homogeny that you see on modern ancestry tests typically only go back a few hundred years, but speaking goes back thousands and thousands of years. So this shouldn't be so foreign, especially from someone like Ngozi, who's recently entertained the idea that E came from West Asia. even with one recreation of Nazlet-Couture, you see the phenotypical variants, one person looking many different ways. We can go back beyond the 300 years of the homogeneity on something like 23andMe. If you want to get into population genetics, I suggest reading the old DNA tribes journals. They had a decent population genetic base, and they used that base to compare STRs and SNPs with different populations, and then they removed some, and through the process of elimination, they could find relationships with people who were more distant. Listen to how DNA tribes described Africans who were in West Asia during the time of the emergence of the early European farmer. In the Arabian Peninsula, early European farmers mixed with ancestral sub-Saharan Africans related to modern Nigerian, Gambian, and Botswanan populations. I want to drift a little off subject for a second because I got a chip on my shoulder because Ngozi blocked me on Twitter because I was challenging him on back migration. And I was using another study, a more recent study on Europeans where they were really tracking identity by descent with European. It's a big study. I'd go into it if it was more on subject, maybe in the future. And I showed that to show that early European farmer ancestry emerged out of Africa. And DNA tribes had the same thing. Well, actually, I didn't even get to this study. This is also from 2014, where they're projecting the distribution of early European farmer ancestry, because he was saying it came from Spain. And the study from, I think, 2022, that was saying no, that it emerged out of like Egypt or the Levant, and they said that it's also in Horners, so it may emerge further south, and it's also in Neolithic Kenyans and I think maybe even Tanzanians. So he blocked me before I can really go to this and drive it home. I don't even know if I showed him the Neolithic Kenyans and Tanzanians. This bootstrap phylogenetic tree, this is something you typically see with animals. It's on researchgate.net. And it's another example of how cavalierly that Greenberg language groupings are used, and they're just widely accepted. But I want to show you one thing here. Notice the Niger-Congo populations are further in the ancestry of everyone. And you just can't say that this is about them mixing with Khoisan people, because the Mende are pretty far from modern Khoisan populations at least. This siphons pretty much everyone's ancestry to some degree back into people who would eventually become Niger-Congo and Bantu speakers. Everyone but Khoisan and Batwa. You also see this with sickle cell distributions, specifically the Benin version. That was reported to what killed King Tut, even though it's not common in modern Egypt. One other thing Kamjiverse showed on Weifel is how R1b, Tut's haplogroup, the modern Egyptian version, is downstream from Chad and Cameroon. Because people often bring up J in relation to the West African connection to Sumerians, but even though J would have been influenced by the bootstrap phylogenetic tree I mentioned earlier, let's go before J. Mostly want to talk about E and L. The origin of E has changed a bit. Early is found in many different places. The West African origin is starting to gain heat because of D0 and DE in Nigeria, but a lot of Central Africa isn't really tested that strong. So I want to table the origin of E and just talk about how Old E is intertwined in West Asia and West Africa and other populations. So let's go. Don't get me wrong, I could debate the origin of E, especially when we start to talk about competition and population numbers. It screams an African origin. Let's stay with Weifel. Let's look at that EM23. Now that was recently changed to EM132. And you can look that up. It's the same group. Now let's take a look at this on Weifel. EM132. And you can see it's pretty large. Now this is E1A. This is an old branch. And you see it starts to pop up around 4,000 years ago. And I think this is Switzerland, France, Yemen. And you can follow these lines. This is all coming from EM132. Portugal, Saudi Arabia, USA. I mean, it wasn't really in the USA. And you start to see it's intertwined. This is probably an African American since this is intertwined with African. Saudi Arabia, USA again, Italy, and you can see this 20,000 years ago starts to diverge, and it's in Gambia. Weifel's kind of weird like that because a lot of times you'll see an older instance further down, and it's really just kind of an estimation. But here's a good example. Like if you look at the earliest E, they're estimating 52,000, 62,000 right here. And if you scroll down, you'll see this becomes EM98, which I'll get to. With EM75, you got to kind of follow this, and you'll see like the oldest instance is in Ethiopia. So like this is the type of thing I'd have to talk about if I'm saying that it's a West African origin, because Weifel would say Ethiopian origin, but looking at DE and like I said, Wikipedia also has instances of old E everywhere, but Weifel doesn't necessarily have everything that's reported, period, much less just in Wikipedia. M98 is also an old clade. You see this in Weifel, at least in Yoruba, and then you also see it in the USA, and then that's probably like foundational descendants of slavery, and then you see it in Arabia, and it's intertwined back and forth with Gambia. Like if you go to Weifel and look and just scroll down on your own. Wikipedia also has it in the Mossi people in Burkina Faso. M78 is also pretty old, not as old as the other ones, and it's split. If you look at the time period around the same time, and you see clades in Cameroon, you see it in Turkey, and there's other populations that Wikipedia speaks of. Early M78 is mostly East African, but I'm showing that it's also in some West African populations. V12 is kind of old too. God, I got a lot of junk over here. But anyhow, you scroll down with V12, and I think even Wikipedia plots it more in East Africa, but if you scroll down in Weifel, you have Sudan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, but it's very old in West Africa. Like this is an old split. ADOS again, Senegal, Gambia, and then intertwined again with a split in Palestine and Syria. Let me get one more with the EM35, because this is like 34,000 years ago, and this is really it's intertwined different places, but the oldest instance, Gambia again. And you start to see it in a bunch of different places. Armenia, Turkey, Hungary, Algeria, Italy, Cameroon branches. Old E. Old E. So let's move on. The phylogenetic tree isn't really that strong with A on Y full, but Wikipedia speaks about Asian branches of A, and since it's not that strong, there isn't really much of a case about it being recent or it being part of an older connection. Okay, let's get to the women. Uh, since it's Y full and not mtDNA full, we're limited to the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, what they report to Wikipedia. So I'm just going to read from Wikipedia, and if you want to, you can pull up my words and quotes and follow along. Let's start with L0. Unlike the other branches of L, Wikipedia doesn't really give that much detail about it. It does show you, though, it does show that LO is distributed into East Africa and outside of Africa, and it makes this climb in the LSA, which is late Stone Age. So yeah, even though it's possible that a lot of this is new, could be concubine, but it would be concubine more through the available populations in East Africa, and these populations would have been on the border and would have traveled. So who knows what that peak in Turkey is from? But there, like I said, there's not much reporting of L in Wikipedia. So let's move to L1. L1 really is not doing much outside of Africa. It does climb from like the west to the east, ending up at like 1% in Egypt, and it is found outside Africa. It's just really rare. L2 is much more common outside of Africa. It's mentioned several times. The one branch L2A1B, it's found in Mozambique, Kenya, and also Kuwait. L2A1C is Southern Africa, Eastern Africa. L2A1C1, it's A1C1 is found in Tunisians, Moroccans, Egyptians, Nubians, Yemeni. There's a more European branch of L2, L2A1K. There's a more like North African, Northwest African L2A1 in Algeria, L2A1, and I think that's just L2A1 pure. So it's upstream from the others. It's in Sierra Leone with Mende, Gambia, Wolof people, and also in Algeria. And then there's a split off of that that's also found in Western Europe and in Fula. And also Pana people who I've never heard of who are in Burkina Faso. Now L3 is killing game, and you can see it right here with this map, but I'm also going to read through some of these clades. L3D looks like Mboli's map. It looks like you can see it. It's Central Africa, Fulani, Chad, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Yemeni, Egyptians, Berbers. L3E5, you don't really see it that far west on this, but they describe it as originating in the Chad Basin, also in Algeria, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and you can see these are also spreading into Asia. L3F, this one seems to have gone from east to west, from Eastern Africa to Chad. L3B, East Africa, West Central. And you can also see like there's some L3B clades like L3B1A2 that's in the Maghreb, in the Middle East, and L3K, the Sahel, North Africa. And I don't even see it. Do we have L3K on here? Maybe, yeah. So there's also L3X that's pretty much locked in East Africa. Same with L3H. But again, like these are all intertwined with ancestry that's siphoning towards those Niger Congo Bantu groupings from Greenberg. L3H2 is more northeastern Africa locked. And you also see this with M1. Uh, and people, I think, lean towards M having an African origin, but I can make a case for U6 based on it being like the big sister branch of U. And where it came from, we have an okay phylogenetic tree of U, but it's not really as strong as I'd like for it to be to really make that point clear. Like I've seen this one mtDNA phylogenetic tree with N1, but that's sort of besides the point. These are old genetic connections, and while it's true that a lot of this is new, the older ones become rare in time. And the best example of how things become rare in time is A00. I'm talking about Y chromosome A00. Find it in African Americans, and that kind of gives a map to where you can find it in Africa. And then after testing possibly millions of people before you see A00, just testing these few samples that you have in ancient Africa, you find it in Shamaka, Cameroon, which it was basically a cave. It was like 7,000-year-old cave, and boom, like who knows, at least hundreds of thousands of people test it, and you test 4 people in a cave and you find A00. So these older clades, they begin to shrink in number. So I can't think of a better place to end it than with Shamlaka. So like and subscribe, and most of all, share this video.